Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
Children of the Salt Marsh. Claire Winslow had never expected a town like this. From the moment she crossed the narrow bridge spanning the dark, brackish water, a shiver ran down her spine. Not from cold, but from the strange, uneasy silence that clung to the streets. The marsh lay like a grey breathing thing, just beyond the edges of the town, thick fog curling over reeds and mud flats, swallowing the horizon. Every house she passed was weather-beaten, with cracked paint and shutters crooked from years of storms. She had taken the job at the small elementary school thinking it would be a quiet assignment, a chance to settle somewhere far from city chaos. But the town exuded a feeling that gnawed at the edge of her logic, as though it were holding its breath and watching her, waiting for something. Claire had spent her first morning at the school meeting teachers and walking the hallways. Principal Hollis, a short-stooped man with thin grey hair, welcomed her with a polite handshake, but his eyes lingered too long on the windows, as if expecting to see something there. "You'll find we do things differently here," he said, smiling with a tension that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Some traditions are old. You'll understand." Claire had nodded, forcing a smile, but unease curled in her chest. She had worked in hospitals where nothing shocked her, but the air in this town felt heavier, like it carried stories that refused to be spoken aloud. She spent the morning observing classrooms, taking notes on student behavior, and familiarizing herself with the building. At first glance, the children appeared ordinary, laughing, running between classes, sharing whispered jokes. But then she noticed subtle details that made her stomach tighten. Fingers tracing behind ears, small pink ridges that seemed too uniform to be accidental, a slight wetness at the nape of a neck that disappeared when she looked closer. She shook her head and told herself it was imagination, shadows cast by the morning light, or perhaps the remnants of some old rash. And yet, the thought that flitted through her mind, gills, refused to leave. By the second day, whispers had begun. Teachers avoided her questions with practiced, uneasy smiles, and a few parents lingered at the school doors, watching her with polite but tense expressions. She overheard snippets, mothers mentioning the watching hours and fathers muttering that the children must settle by dawn. Claire pressed for details, asking if it was some old superstition, some harmless ritual, but the adults laughed nervously and changed the subject. Every conversation ended with a vague warning not to pry. That night, Claire received a call she could not ignore. A young mother, voice trembling and near hysterical, said her baby was not breathing normally. Claire rushed to the house, following narrow, winding roads that ended in a cluster of small homes at the marsh's edge. The fog clung to the ground, curling around her shoes, and the reeds whispered in the wind. When she arrived, the mother opened the door in a panic, her eyes wide and shining with fear. It's not right," she cried, grabbing Claire by the arm and pulling her inside. The nursery was dim, lit only by a single lamp, draped in a yellowed cloth that filtered the light into shadow. The air smelled damp, faintly briny, and something else Claire couldn't identify. Something metallic and sour. In the crib lay a newborn, no more than 3 days old, pale and trembling, chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. And there, beneath the skin at the sides of its neck, faint ridges quivered, wet and pink, as if something was alive beneath the surface. The gills. Claire froze, her hands hovering over the child. The parents murmured in low tones, rocking the baby gently, repeating words she did not understand. The infant cried, but not like any baby she had ever seen. The sound was harsh, rasping, as though air itself was foreign to it. The gill slits pulsed violently, stretching in tiny arcs, and then retreating, as if something beneath the skin was clawing its way out. Claire's heart raced. She had treated all manner of medical emergencies, But nothing prepared her for this. A newborn fighting a body she did not fully recognize as human. The mother refused to let her take the infant to the hospital, shaking her head, panic flashing across her face. "The marsh," she whispered. "The marsh will be angry if it's moved." Claire looked toward the window facing the reeds and saw them, dark shapes shifting in the fog, impossibly tall and still, almost human, watching the house. Her stomach churned. Ah! The shadows did not move like normal people. They waited, their presence almost physical in its pressure. Claire tried to calm the baby, rocking it gently, speaking in a soft voice, but every attempt to soothe it seemed to fail until she instinctively brought it closer to the window facing the marsh. The infant's thrashing slowed, its rasping cries turning to whimpers. A cold realization spread through Claire. This child, this helpless, perfect newborn, responded not to care or medicine, but to proximity to the marsh itself. The shapes outside did not merely watch, they commanded, and the child obeyed. By the time she left the house, dawn was breaking, grey light spilling across the marsh, and the fog had begun to lift. The infant slept in the mother's arms, the gill ridges now faint and slack. Claire walked back to her car, mind racing. She had come to this town expecting normalcy, expecting quiet, mundane days. Instead, she had found something ancient, something that lingered beneath the mud and reeds, watching, waiting, and taking what it claimed. She did not yet know the extent of it, nor did she understand the rules. But one thing was certain. The town was not ordinary, and the children were not safe. Not from the marsh, and not from what the marsh demanded. And as she drove back toward the school, the first sounds of the day reached her ears. The faint, high-pitched cries of a child carried on the wind, distant but unmistakable, echoing from the marsh like a warning. The next morning, Claire woke with a heaviness pressing on her chest. The fog still lay thick across the streets, curling into corners and drifting through the marsh like it had a life of its own. She arrived at the school early, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice aloud. Every instinct she had told her the events of the previous night were more than coincidence. Yet the adults she tried to speak with greeted her with polite smiles and averted eyes. It was as if acknowledging what had happened might summon it again. She spent the morning making her rounds, observing the children as best she could. They seemed normal at first, running across the playground, their laughter sharp and clear. But as she watched, small details began to unsettle her further. Fingers tracing the sides of necks, subtle shivers that passed over the children like a whisper. Only they could hear. One little boy, Samuel, stood near the edge of the playground, staring at the marsh for minutes at a time, his hands clenched at his sides, jaw tight. His eyes were unusually dark, and when he noticed Claire watching him, he tilted his head just slightly, a gesture too deliberate to be casual. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him. During lunch, she sat in the teacher's lounge, reviewing the infant charts she had been allowed to see. Every record stopped abruptly at 3 days old. No further notes, no follow-up on growth, feeding, or medical issues. Every newborn seemed to vanish into some unspoken protocol, and the parents' reactions when she asked were subtle but unmistakable. A stiffening of the shoulders, a tightening of the jaw, a warning in their eye. Even Principal Hollis avoided her gaze. Claire's sense of unease coiled tighter. Something about the children, and the way the town treated them, was not normal, and it was hiding just beneath the surface. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fog pressed against her window, and the sound of water moving through reeds carried into her room like whispers. Driven by a mixture of dread and professional curiosity, Claire stepped outside, flashlight in hand, to examine the marsh. The mud squelched beneath her boots, and the reeds whispered against her arms. Then she noticed it. Footprints. Small, bare footprints, perfectly spaced, leading from the edge of the school property straight into the fog. She followed them, heart hammering, and realized that they weren't random. They stopped at a point where the marsh seemed unnaturally still, the water's surface smooth as glass. As she crouched to examine the ground, a chill ran up her spine. There, half buried in the mud, were tiny bones, pale and almost translucent, smaller than any human child's should be. They were dry, desiccated, like they had been left out for months. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. She had seen death in hospitals, yes, but this was different. Something deliberate, something unnatural. The bones were not just remains, they were warnings. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, though no one was in sight. Something was watching from the reeds, waiting, patient. Claire returned to her room trembling, but the sense of being watched did not leave. She spent hours poring over the medical charts again, her hands trembling as she traced lines that abruptly ended at 3 days. Every birth had been meticulously recorded until that point, then nothing. She pulled out her notebook, jotting down observations about the gill-like ridges, the watching hours, and the parents' nervous whispers. Something ancient had claimed these children, she realized, and anyone who resisted, the child, or even those who asked questions, was at risk. Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise outside her window. Low, wet, and rhythmic. Footsteps. No, something heavier. Something dragging. Claire froze, listening guts. What did he tell you? The sound came from the direction of the marsh, where the fog was thickest. Then she saw them, shapes moving at the edge of the fog, upright, small, impossibly still. Children, but not quite children. Their heads tilted in unison as if responding to some signal, their eyes dark, reflecting the faint moonlight. One stepped forward, its foot leaving a clean impression in the wet mud before it disappeared again. Claire's pulse jumped. She had never seen them move like that, so precise, so silent. The shapes lingered for hours, until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Claire stayed awake, hidden behind the curtains, watching them. When the fog finally lifted, they were gone, leaving only footprints that led back into the marsh, disappearing into mud and reeds. She stepped outside the next morning to examine the trail. The footprints were still there, but faintly, almost as if the mud itself tried to erase them. Claire knew then that the children were not merely human, or at least not entirely. Something claimed them, drew them toward the marsh, and enforced obedience through fear and transformation. That afternoon, Claire visited the home of Samuel, the boy who had stared at the marsh all morning. His mother was tense, wringing her hands in the kitchen. "He doesn't sleep well," she said, avoiding Claire's gaze. "He cries at night, talking about water, about voices. I think you should leave him alone." Claire frowned. She had a professional duty to intervene. Something was happening to these children, and she could no longer ignore it. She watched Samuel play in the yard, his dark eyes constantly scanning the reeds, and felt a sinking certainty that he was already resisting whatever power the marsh held over him. As the sun did below the horizon, the fog returned with the night, and Claire found herself drawn once again to the edge of the marsh. The smell of brine and decay hung heavy in the air, and she could see the faintest ripples on the water's surface, as if something beneath it stirred in response to her presence. In the distance, a faint, high-pitched cry echoed across the marsh. Not a child's cry. Something older, something that carried awareness. Claire's stomach twisted. She understood in that moment that the marsh was not passive. It was alive, patient, and hungry. And the children, every one of them, belonged to it. Claire Winslow felt the weight of the marsh pressing against her chest as she drove toward the oldest part of town. The streets were narrow, lined with houses that leaned like tired old men, and the fog rolled in from the water with a persistence that made the world seem smaller, more claustrophobic. Her mind churned with everything she had seen. The gills, the footprints, the desiccated husks, half buried in mud. She needed answers, and she knew the only people who might have them were those who had lived with the marsh long enough to fear it without speaking. Her first stop was Elder Marlowe's house, a squat structure at the edge of the high marsh, surrounded by reeds and the skeletal remains of old docks. Marlowe was a thin man with a hawkish nose and eyes that never seemed to blink in unison. When Claire mentioned the children, he stiffened, and for a moment she thought he would shut the door in her face. Instead, he sighed and motioned her inside, muttering, "Curiosity isn't always safe, Miss Winslow, but some truths are worse than ignorance." Nice. Inside, the house smelled of salt, mold, and something faintly metallic. Shelves sagged under the weight of old books and jars containing things she did not want to examine too closely. Marlowe led her to a small parlor where a single lamp burned, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. "The children," he said, his voice gravelly, "are not ours. Not really. They belong to the marsh, and it claims them in its own time. We do what we can to keep them acceptable for 3 days, until it decides if they are obedient or not." "No, ye. Of me?" Claire frowned. "Obedient to what?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to a cabinet, pulling out a small, leather-bound ledger. "Records," he said. "Births, deaths, transformations. Every child that resists the claiming ends here." He opened it to reveal pages with tiny sketches and notes, each line chronicling the first 72 hours of life. Claire's eyes fell on one entry, a child she recognized from the school registry. Its page ended with a dark stain that looked almost like dried blood. She shivered. Before she could ask more, a sudden commotion outside made both of them tense. Through the window, Claire saw a small figure struggling near the edge of the marsh, a newborn in the arms of a frantic mother. The infant screamed, high-pitched and rasping, and something about the way it moved, thrashing violently yet unnaturally, froze her blood. Marlowe's hand gripped hers. "Not all survive," he whispered. They rushed outside, but it was too late. The mother, distraught, could do nothing as the child's body began to contort, the skin drying and cracking in seconds. Claire's medical training recoiled in horror. The infant's features stretched, shrank, and then hardened like parched clay. The final sound the child made was a high, keening wail, not quite human, echoing across the marsh before stopping abruptly. All that remained was a husk, pale, cracked, and staring blankly. Claire staggered back, nausea twisting her stomach. Marlowe's expression was grave. "This is the fate of those who resist," he said. "The marsh does not forgive. It takes what it wants, and the rest are left hollow. Nearer you are." Claire's mind raced. But why? Why the gills? Why 3 days? Ning Mizedraya. He shook his head. "We only know what has always been. They are born to the marsh first, to its tides and waters. If they obey, the gills seal, and they live. If they resist, they die. And that is all we know." "No." The wind shifted, carrying a whisper from the reeds that made Claire's skin crawl. She turned toward the marsh and saw the silhouettes of older children, standing motionless, their heads tilted in unison. One stepped forward, leaving footprints that led toward the high marsh, and she felt in the marrow of her bones that they were watching her, judging her. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Claire tried to process it. Logic fought against instinct, but instinct screamed louder. The marsh was not passive. It was alive, sentient, and it claimed its own with ruthless precision. Every child she had seen, the infants in their cribs, the older children on the playground, was already part of something vast, something ancient and patient. The footprints in the mud, the ripples in the water, the husks of those who had resisted, they were all proof of the marsh's authority. Marl led her back inside, closing the door as if sealing out more than just the wind. "You should not linger near the water," he said. "It can sense curiosity, fear, defiance, and it is patient, always patient. Do not make the mistake of thinking you can save them all." Nay. Claire sat in the small parlour, trembling, staring at the ledger, at the sketches, at the stains. Her mind raced through medical possibilities, psychological rationales, any explanation that could prevent her from believing the impossible. But she could not. Every instinct told her the marsh was right. It had always been right, and no human understanding could contend with it. She realized with a sinking, icy certainty that she was not merely observing this horror. She was now part of it. The day passed in a blur. Claire returned to the school, trying to act normal, but every corridor, every laughing child, every classroom door seemed to pulse with unseen life. Samuel, the boy who had watched the marsh the day before, avoided her gaze, but she felt it lingering, heavy, accusatory. The other children, older now, moved with an unnatural precision, a sway in time with some invisible tide, heads tilting in unison, hands brushing against their necks as if sensing some hidden pulse. Claire knew without needing to see it that the gills had already begun their work on them. That night she did not sleep. The fog pressed against her window again, carrying with it the faint scent of brine and decay. From the marsh came a cry, high-pitched, unnatural, echoing across the reeds. Claire pressed herself against the wall, the sound vibrating through her chest. She thought of the infant she had seen die, of Samuel and the other children, and of the vast patient power that ruled them all. And as the night dragged on, she knew one unalterable truth. The marsh would not forgive, and it would not forget. And soon, she feared, it would not ignore her either. The fog hung thick over the marsh, curling and twisting as though it had a mind of its own. Each step along the narrow path felt heavier than the last, mud squelching beneath her boots, reeds scratching at her coat. Claire had made up her mind to find Agnes Fenwick, the reclusive midwife, whose knowledge of the town's children was whispered about with fear and reverence. Stories claimed she had delivered every guild child in the town for decades, and that she alone understood the full horror of what happened when one resisted the claiming. By the time she reached the crooked, weather-worn house, the sun had nearly disappeared behind a bank of grey clouds, leaving the marsh in a gloom that seemed almost solid. The door swung open before she could knock, and Claire was met with the midwife's sharp, assessing gaze. Agnes was thin, almost skeletal, her hair pale and stiff like dried reeds, and her skin had the brittle translucence of old parchment. "I've been expecting you," she said, voice brittle but commanding. She stepped aside, and Claire entered, the smell of salt and herbs washing over her. Inside the house was a cluttered labyrinth of shadow and brine-scented air. Shelves sagged under jars of preserved seaweed, small bones, and scraps of fabric, each labelled in delicate, careful handwriting. Candles flickered in sconces along the walls, casting moving shadows that seemed almost to watch Claire as she walked. Agnes gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed, though unease settled deep in her chest. "You want to know about the children?" Agnes said finally, folding her hands on the table. "About what happens when the gills want seal." Her eyes narrowed. "Be warned, miss. Curiosity has a cost." Claire's throat felt tight. "I need to know. I saw what happened. I can't pretend it's normal." "The infants." Agnes held up a thin, trembling hand. "I know. You saw the punishment. You saw the hollowing. And now you are awake to it. Few survive seeing it and remaining, untouched by fear. The midwife's gaze drifted to the window, to the fog-shrouded marsh beyond. Outside, shadows stirred at the edge of the reeds, shapes shifting too deliberately to be children playing. Older kids, already part marsh, moved in a rhythm unnatural to human movement, hands brushing the sides of their necks, as if sensing some hidden pulse beneath the skin. Claire's stomach twisted. They were watching, always watching. Agnes spoke again, voice low and urgent. Every child born here is claimed first by the marsh. For 72 hours it tests them. If the child obeys, if the gills close, and it accepts its place, they survive. If they resist, her hands trembled slightly. They are left hollowed, shriveled, screaming, until nothing of them remains but a husk. Claire swallowed, horrified. Has anyone ever survived resistance? The midwife's eyes hardened. Some adapt. Some bend. Most do not. And those who do survive, they are never the same again. The marsh marks them in ways you cannot unsee. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You must understand. The marsh is patient. It is intelligent, aware of everything within its reach. It can feel defiance, curiosity, fear. Every question you ask draws its attention. Every step you take near its waters invites it to watch you. No. The wind shifted outside, carrying a faint, high-pitched cry across the reeds. Claire froze. It was not a normal child's cry. It was aware, older, and something in it made her bones ache with a mixture of fear and fascination. A dark figure stepped forward at the marsh's edge, pausing just long enough for her to see its small, precise movements. It left a single deliberate footprint in the mud, before retreating into the fog. Claire felt a chill wrap around her chest. The marsh was aware of her now. Hours passed. Agnes spoke of the town's history with the marsh. Children who had been claimed for generations, disappearances without records, graves left unmarked along the tidal flats. She described rituals long abandoned, sacrifices returned to the marsh, and the hollowed children whose bodies had been left as warnings. Claire scribbled notes, but each word made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The midwife's tone was matter-of-fact, yet it carried the weight of decades of terror, of witnessing defiance punished again and again. Claire could not help herself. She pressed further. Why gills? Why 72 hours? Why is the marsh alive? Nature. Agnes's eyes glinted. Questions, yes, but no answers. The marsh predates this town. It predates your medicine, your science, your understanding. It is old as the tides, patient as the rocks, and it will have what it wants. The gills are the first connection, the first test, and when they close, the child is bound to it. To resist is death. Wow! A sudden noise outside made Claire flinch. The sound of dragging footsteps through mud, wet and deliberate, came from the edge of the marsh. She peered out the window, and her stomach knotted. Shapes were moving again, small silhouettes drifting with an unnatural grace. One older child stepped forward, raised a hand to the side of the neck, paused, and retreated. The precision of their movement suggested obedience, a mimicry of the marsh itself. Claire realized with cold certainty that they were no longer fully human. They had begun to merge with the marsh in ways that were both subtle and horrifying. Agnes watched her, expression unreadable. Some children fight, some try to run. Those are the ones who die first. Yeah, the marsh is patient, but it does not forget. And it always claims what it has been promised. The sun had set fully by the time Claire left, leaving her path through the reeds almost invisible. Each step felt like wading through invisible currents, the fog curling at her ankles and tugging at her coat. She glanced back at Agnes' house once. The shadows within flickered, as if the midwife herself were a part of some silent vigil, watching the marsh and the children alike. The cries echoed again, high and keening, bouncing over the reeds and mudflats. Claire knew she had crossed a line. The curiosity that had brought her here had not gone unnoticed. Her thoughts returned to the children, the infants whose gills were closing, the older ones who had begun to move with tidal precision, and those who had resisted and paid the ultimate price. The marsh was patient, yes, but it was also ruthless, and now it had a new observer in Claire. Every question she had asked, every note she had taken, every step she had made had placed her firmly in its notice. And somewhere in the fog, among the reeds, the marsh waited, watching, knowing, patiently waiting for the next act, the next resistance, the next scream. The sun had barely burned through the fog when Claire followed the muddy trail that snaked through the high reeds. Each step sank her boots deeper into the marsh, sucking mud, leaving a trail that threatened to pull her back as if the ground itself remembered her. The fog was thinner than last night, but the marsh felt heavier, alive in a way that pressed against her senses. Every bird call, every subtle splash of water made her flinch, as though something unseen lurked just beneath the surface, observing. She had no map, no directions, only the faint memory of an old crooked shack she had glimpsed in the distance from the town's edge weeks ago. Now the building materialized before her like a half-forgotten memory. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and the wooden planks of its walls were streaked with salt and moss. A thin trail of smoke curled from a crooked chimney, pungent with brine and herbs. The marsh around it was unusually still, the water flat and glassy, betraying nothing of the horrors it had harbored. Claire hesitated at the threshold, her instinct screaming to turn back, but curiosity and dread propelled her forward. A frail voice called out before she could knock. "I've been expecting you." Inside, the shack smelled of salt, earth, and decay, mingled with the faint sweetness of dried herbs. Shelves lined with jars and bundles of seaweed leaned precariously on the walls. Amid the clutter, an elderly woman sat in a high-backed chair, her eyes bright and unnervingly alert. She was small, gnarled, with fingers like the twisted roots of a tree, but there was a certainty in her gaze that made Claire feel both welcome and uncomfortably exposed. "You want to know the truth," the woman said, her voice rasping but steady. "The town lies. They lie to protect themselves, but not the children. Not anymore." No. Claire's throat tightened. "I saw what happens. The husks, the children drying out. Why? Why does it happen?" "No. Sorry, the midwife, her name was Marnie, leaned forward, her knuckles white against the chair's arms. "Those are not deformities," she said firmly. "The gills, they are the remnants of what the children are, what they were meant to be. Every child born here carries it. For 72 hours, the water tests them. If the entity beneath the marsh accepts their nature, they can return, breathe, swim, be what they were meant to be. But those who resist, who reject the calling..." She paused, letting her words hang. "Dry out. Their blood retreats from the skin, their bodies desiccate. They scream. Then nothing remains but a husk. You saw one, didn't you?" "Adish." Claire nodded slowly, unable to speak. The memory of that infant, curled and shriveled in the mud, came rushing back. She could still hear the high, keening wail echoing in her mind. Marnie's eyes narrowed. "The town made a pact generations ago. A survival pact. They allowed the entity to reclaim children who were meant for the water, those who were not. They live human, normal, as best they can. But something has changed. More children are resisting. More husks appear. The marsh is growing impatient, perhaps even hungry. Even the town elders whisper of it, but none dare confront it directly. Not anymore. Claire felt the floor shift beneath her chest, a slow, almost imperceptible vibration, as if the marsh itself were listening to their conversation. "Why now?" she asked, voice trembling. "Why are more children resisting?" The midwife's thin lips pressed together. The marsh has always been patient, but centuries of feeding, of taking its chosen, have left it watchful. Some children are born stronger, with wills sharper than before. And it is changing, subtly. Something stirs beneath the water that makes the claiming more violent, more absolute. She pulled a tattered blanket from a corner and laid it across her lap. Beneath it, the faintest movement stirred. A hint of life curled up like a coil, so tiny and pale it might have been a newborn, yet the shadow of gills pressed faintly against the skin. "They are coming back differently," Marnie whispered. Claire's pulse thumped. "And the town? What do they do when a child resists?" Marnie's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the fog-wrapped marsh. "We watch. We guide. But the marsh always decides. The husks are the proof. And now, with more resistance, the frequency of husks has grown. Soon, it will not stop. Now, I'll say." Claire struggled to absorb the enormity of what she had learned. The gills, the claiming, the pact the town had made generations ago. It was worse than anything she could have imagined. Every observation, every strange movement of the children, every husk she had seen suddenly made sense. The children were not human entirely. Some were reclaimable, part human and part creature. And the others were offered as proof of the marsh's authority. A sudden sound, low and wet, made her flinch. Something dragged itself through the mud outside, brushing against the house. Claire pressed against the wall instinctively. Through the window, she glimpsed a figure, a small child, pale as bone, moving with impossible speed, crawling from the reeds like a creature, half fish, half human. Its eyes were black, reflecting the weak sunlight, and it stopped at the edge of the marsh, head tilting as if assessing her. It hissed, a sound that resonated through the air, and in her chest simultaneously. Claire felt a tremor of fear that she could not shake. Marnie noticed her reaction. "You have been observed for some time," she said. "The marsh knows you are curious. It always knows. Curiosity is a beacon. Do not think you can leave without being noted. You are already part of its attention." "No." Claire swallowed hard. What can I do?" The midwife shook her head. "You can do nothing but survive your awareness. Watch, learn, and try not to draw it to you. The children, the resistant ones, are becoming fewer but fiercer, and every time a child resists, the marsh answers. With husks, with screams, with hunger. You cannot fight it. You cannot reason with it. Only witness." "Ow." Claire's stomach twisted. She thought of Samuel, of the other children she had seen. The ones whose gills were closing now. The ones whose tiny bodies quivered with the unseen tide calling them. So the marsh chooses, and the town watches. That's a pact. That's all. Is it right? Marnie nodded. Yes. Survival comes at a cost. We take what is necessary and we allow what can't be taken to continue. But the balance is shifting. You will see husks. You will see defiance. And soon, perhaps, you will see what happens when the marsh grows tired of waiting. One say. Outside, a sudden ripple in the water caught Claire's attention. Shapes moved beneath the surface, tiny shadows darting just out of sight. The marsh was alive, always alive, responding to her presence, to the very questions she had asked. The thought made her chest tighten. When Claire finally left, the air seemed thicker, almost suffocating. The trail back to town was lined with reeds that scraped her arms like the fingers of some unseen hand. Each step squelched deeper into mud. Each breath carried the faint tang of brine. Somewhere in the fog, children watched, patient, waiting, testing, part human, part marsh. And she knew she had glimpsed only the beginning of their truth. The husks, the resistance, the pact, all were real. And the marsh, it had taken notice of her curiosity. The marsh was quiet. As Claire retraced her steps from Marnie's shack, the fog curling thickly around her legs, mud sucking at her boots with every step. Her mind raced with what she had learned, the truth about the gills, the claiming, the town's generations' old pact. Even as she walked, the silence felt too heavy, oppressive, as if the marsh itself was aware of her thoughts, waiting to judge them. Without warning, the mud beneath her gave way differently this time. A slick, writhing grip latched around her legs, icy and slimy. And she stumbled forward. Panic surged as she realized she was being dragged, waist deep into the murky water. The tendrils were disturbingly human-like, pale and flexible, each one shaped vaguely like tiny arms, their fingers curling into the fabric of her coat and the folds of her skirt. She kicked, clawed at the reeds, but the grip was inexorable. "Let me go," she screamed, voice cracking. Her words seemed swallowed instantly by the dense fog, echoing faintly like a dying whisper across the water. The mud churned beneath her, pulling her deeper, and she could feel her boots sink into the sucking mud, her arms scraping against reeds that seemed to lash her as she struggled. Her pulse pounded in her ears, adrenaline and terror coursing through her. Then she saw them. Shadows moving just beneath the water, human-shaped but impossible. Limbs elongated, pale and smooth as moonlit eels, moving with effortless grace through the murky depths. Faces lifted occasionally toward the surface, small gilled eyes black and unblinking. Their movements were fluid, predatory, and somehow playful, a terrifying elegance that contrasted with the struggle of her own human body. One child surfaced inches from her face. Its gills opened wide, pale pink and glistening in the dim light, the water streaming from them, like veins of liquid moonlight. Its eyes bored into hers, and its voice vibrated inside her skull, rather than through the air. A whisper that made her teeth ache. "You do not belong above the water," it said. The words resonated through her bones, an assertion of ownership that made her knees buckle. She tried to recoil, but the tendrils held her fast. Other children swirled beneath the surface, darting in and out of view, small shapes with unnerving precision. Some paused to observe her, tilting their heads with a faint intelligent curiosity. A sudden flash revealed pale, elongated fingers, webbed slightly, caressing the mud and reeds with a grace that should not have been possible. Claire realized with sickening clarity that this was the form the resistant children were evolving into, a form perfectly adapted to the marsh, a form entirely alien to human understanding. A ripple passed across the water, and the tendrils tightened, drawing her further. She gasped, water and brine mixing in her mouth, the cold shocking her lungs. Flashes beneath the surface revealed more than children. Some bodies were twisted in subtle, horrifying ways. Spines arched unnaturally, hands split into thin tendrils, skin stretched taut and pale. Yet, despite the deformities, each moved with a horrifying perfection, as if guided by the marsh itself. Claire's mind raced, trying to rationalize to find some way out. But fear was fogging her thoughts. The whispering continued, soft but insistent, vibrating directly in her ears. You do not belong. You cannot belong. It was relentless, a mantra she could not escape, echoing in the marrow of her bones. The children's eyes gleamed from beneath the water, black and bottomless, judging her, sensing her resistance, marking her curiosity as trespass. Then one of the tendrils lashed her across the face, the cold slickness burning against her skin. She staggered, vision swimming, and felt something brush against her palm. It was pale, wet, and oddly soft. She recoiled, and it clung briefly before the current dragged it back. A small flash beneath the water revealed the full horror. Pieces of pale skin, impossible to categorize, human, yet not, floating among the twisting shapes of the children. Claire's heart pounded. The marsh was alive in ways she had only begun to understand. It fed on curiosity, on defiance, on resistance. The children were part of it now, fully transformed, and she was just a human caught in its attention. Every step she struggled against, every flailing movement, only drew more attention. Shapes darted closer, watching, circling, their gills opening and closing in rhythmic pulses that seemed to correspond with the marsh itself. One child broke from the swirl, surfacing right beside her. Its small pale hand brushed against her cheek, not roughly, but with a deliberate unsettling gentleness. The whisper came again, vibrating through her skull. You do not belong. You do not belong. It lingered, repeating in a faint, taunting echo, even as she gasped for breath. The words sank into her mind, leaving a hollow, sick sensation of inevitability. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The tendrils released her. She collapsed onto the mudbank, soaked through, clothes clinging to her skin, shivering violently. The fog had thickened, masking everything beneath the surface. In the distance, the figures of the children had vanished, leaving only a few ripples and the faint scent of brine on the wind. Claire's trembling hands reached into her pocket and froze. Something damp and pale pressed against her fingers, sticky and cold. She pulled it out slowly, heart hammering. It was a clump of skin, pale and translucent, not entirely human. Her stomach turned violently. As she stared, horrified, a whisper echoed faintly in her mind, soft, intimate, and impossible to locate. Claire! Claire! The voice had not come from any child she could see, nor any creature she could identify. It was in her skull, in her blood, vibrating in every nerve. She fell back against the bank, brine soaking her hair, the marsh around her silent and watchful. The shadows beneath the fog shifted as if acknowledging her, waiting. Hours later, when she finally found the trail back to the town, the water had returned to its deceptive calm. The sun was gone, leaving only twilight and mist. Claire's limbs ached, her skin burned from cold and salt, and every step through the reeds felt like walking through invisible hands. But in her mind, the whisper lingered, a reminder of what had occurred. Something beneath the water had touched her, and it had left a mark. That night, in the safety of her room, Claire examined the clump of pale matter again. Her fingers trembled as she realized it was organic, soft, and faintly warm. Not fully human, never fully human. Her gaze drifted to the window. Alas! The fog swirled outside, thick and almost alive. Somewhere within, the children waited, patient, watching, their gills pulsing faintly in the weak moonlight. And in the silence of her room, the whisper returned, softer now, more insistent. You do not belong. You cannot belong. Claire sat in her small, cluttered apartment, the fog pressing against the window like a living thing. The clump of pale matter she had retrieved from the marsh lay in a shallow bowl on the table, half wrapped in damp cloth, radiating a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. Her mind refused to rest. Every shadow outside her window seemed alive. Every distant splash in the marsh sounded deliberate, like the slow, patient pulse of some hidden intelligence. Sleep had become impossible. The whispers from the marsh, soft, intimate, insistent, still echoed faintly in her skull, repeating in a low hum, "You do not belong." By morning, she knew she could not remain idle. She returned to the school, determined to investigate further. The town itself seemed complicit in the secret. Its streets empty in the early light, homes shuttered against the fog. Even the parents who greeted her wore strange smiles, their eyes darting nervously toward the marsh, as if it had the power to punish them for acknowledging it. Claire's skin crawled at the realization. The entire community was bound by fear, by a pact older than any living memory. In the nurse's office, she began reviewing medical charts again, painstakingly comparing records. Every child born in the past decade followed the same pattern. Meticulous documentation of the first 72 hours, then abrupt cessation. Notes stopped, parents' observations vanished, and in their place, only a line marking the official transfer of custody to the town's unspoken authority. There was no explanation, no medical reasoning, just silence. And the husks. Claire's stomach tightened each time she thought of the desiccated bodies she had glimpsed in the marsh. Her first stop that afternoon was the home of another family she had noticed. A little girl named Eliza, whose mother seemed unusually tense, and whose father avoided Claire's gaze entirely. "Eliza hasn't been sleeping well," the mother murmured, wringing her hands. She talks to the water. She cries when the marsh calls." The words were whispered, but the fear behind them was tangible. Claire felt a shiver crawl up her spine. This was the pattern. Children resisting, parents afraid. The town silently complicit. Determined to see for herself, Claire lingered outside the home after her visit, watching the girl through a thin curtain. Eliza played in the yard, but her movements were unnatural, too precise. She tilted her head repeatedly, staring toward the reeds, her small fingers brushing the air in gestures that made Claire's stomach knot. Then, as the sun dipped lower, she saw it. The faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of gills along Eliza's neck, pulsing faintly beneath pale skin. The child was resisting the call, or perhaps he had yet to be claimed. Either way, Claire knew the risk. When she returned to her own apartment, the fog had thickened into a viscous wall, pressing against the windows with an almost tactile weight. Claire felt watched, the sensation crawling along her spine, and she could not shake the whispers. She tried to focus on her work, taking notes, sketching diagrams of gills, recording every anomaly. But the awareness of the marsh's eyes, the children's eyes, never left her. Late that evening, she decided to confront the town itself. She walked past shuttered homes, past faces that avoided hers, until she reached the oldest part of the village. A row of crumbling buildings, remnants of the town's founding families. She found herself drawn to a small abandoned hall, the wooden doors warped and bleached by salt. Inside, the floorboards creaked under her weight. On the walls were faint, faded symbols, marks that had been scrubbed from history, but that Claire instinctively recognized as warnings. Protective sigils meant to honor the pact with the marsh. A movement behind her made her whirl. An older man stood in the shadows, stooped and thin, eyes sharp despite his age. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, but with a weight that made Claire tremble. His voice carried a history she could not name, but one that spoke of long nights and dark decisions. "The children belong to the marsh," he continued. "Some must be taken. Some must be spared. The balance, it cannot be broken." "Nee." Claire's hands clenched at her sides. "You're letting them die?" The husks. The children who resist. They're being destroyed. How can you live with this? Now? The man shook his head slowly, a shadow of sadness crossing his features. We survive by the rules set long ago. Yes, the town survives. The children, some belong, some don't. It's never been cruel. It is necessary. His gaze hardened. And now, with more resistance, the marsh is growing. Impatient. It will claim what it must, and we simply watch. Witnessing is all we can do. Well, no. And I say, Claire felt bile rise in her throat. Watch, she spat. You just watch, while children die, while the marsh. Her words caught in her throat as a sudden wet ripple sounded through the hall, echoing faintly from the broken windows. The temperature dropped, and the faint scent of brine and decay filled the air. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like fingers, thick and unyielding. The man's expression remained calm. It has noticed you, he said quietly. Curiosity is dangerous. You will see more. You will hear more. And it will test you, as it tests all who pry. Nat. Claire back toward the door. Heart hammering. And if I try to help them, if I try to intervene, just... He shook his head. The marsh does not negotiate. It does not forgive. The children who resist, they are its judgment. The town cannot interfere. We can only survive ourselves, and hope you do the same. Nuance. Bayardi. Outside, the fog thickened to the point that the buildings around her disappeared. Shapes moved just beyond her vision, small, pale, and fluid. The shadows of children, watching, waiting. Their eyes were endless black pools, reflecting nothing but hunger and patience. Claire shivered. Even here, on solid ground, even in the supposed safety of the town, the marsh and its children were watching, aware, ever patient. That night, back in her apartment, Claire could not sleep. She heard the faint slap of water against reeds, whispers echoing softly in the fog. You do not belong. You cannot belong. Her hands shook as she jotted notes, sketches, observations. She knew she could not unsee what she had witnessed, could not ignore the truth of the town's complicity. The pact, the husks, the resistant children, all were part of a hidden system she had stumbled into, one older and far more deliberate than she had imagined. The fog pressed against the window again, almost tangible. Claire's gaze drifted to the shallow bowl on the table, the clump of pale matter quivering faintly. She felt its warmth, soft and insistent, as if it had a life of its own. Her stomach twisted at the thought that something in that mass had come from the marsh, from the children, from the entity beneath the water that claimed what it would. And in the whispering silence, she knew the marsh had marked her, as it had promised, as it had tested her curiosity. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest ripple disturbed the fog. Claire swallowed hard. She could feel eyes on her, and she understood, with a rising dread, that the children were watching her even now, waiting for the moment when they would decide her fate. Or at least, when in the marsh would. The fog had settled thick and damp over the town by the time Claire stepped outside again. Every step through the narrow streets felt like treading through memory and menace at once. The town seemed to hold its breath, as though aware of her intrusion. The faint smell of brine clung to the air, thickening her every breath. She moved toward the outskirts, toward the cluster of homes closest to the marsh, where resistance had been reported most recently. Her boots sank into wet mud as she approached a small yard, partially overgrown with reeds. There, a cluster of children played, or appeared to play, but their movements were off, stiff and deliberate, punctuated by moments of eerie fluidity. Claire's stomach churned as she recognized the same unnatural gill pulses she had seen before. They were resisting, some more openly than others, their limbs twitching in defiance of the water calling them. Suddenly, one child broke from the group and charged toward the marsh. Claire ran after her, heart hammering, fear and determination colliding. The girl's limbs moved awkwardly on land. But the moment she hit the water, her body elongated in a grotesque perfection, gills opening wide. A scream tore from Claire's throat as she saw the child's skin stretch unnaturally, pale and slick as the entity beneath the water pulled her down. The girl's eyes, wide with terror and understanding, locked onto Claire's for a fraction of a second before disappearing beneath the black surface. Claire's hand shook as she reached for the girl, but the water was empty again. A ripple, then a splash, a signal of the marsh's patience and cruelty. Around her, other children lingered at the edge, watching with those endless black eyes. Some whispered in unison, voices low and vibrating, faint but carrying directly into her mind. You do not belong. You cannot belong. The refrain was maddening, echoing in the marrow of her bones. She backed away from the water, fear twisting her gut. But the marsh had not finished with her. Tendrils, slick and thin, reached out from the reeds, pale and limbed like the tiny human arms she had encountered before. They wrapped around her ankles, tugging insistently, reminding her that the marsh did not forgive intrusion, did not negotiate. She stumbled, dragging her boots through mud and water, heart hammering, lungs aching. Then she saw them, resistant children, bodies twisted, but still human enough to recognize, hovering at the marsh's edge. Their gills pulsed in soft, rhythmic waves. Some were half submerged, others standing at the waterline, their pale hands twitching like the fingers of corpses reaching for her. Their eyes held a dreadful awareness, a combination of fear and predatory anticipation. One girl, no older than 6, tilted her head unnaturally, staring directly at Claire, whispering, "You do not belong." Claire turned her attention to the ground and noticed something worse. Patches of the marsh were littered with desiccated husks, smaller than human children, sun-bleached and fragile as paper. Their gills were rigid, bone-white, permanently frozen in screaming expressions. The smell of salt and decay clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. She realized with a sick, hollow certainty, these were the ones who had resisted too long, who had failed to yield to the call. The marsh had consumed them entirely, leaving only reminders of its inexorable will. Her mind reeled as she watched. A ripple of movement drew her gaze to the water again. Children, fully adapted now, swam beneath the surface in a mesmerizing display. Their limbs were elongated, almost eel-like, skin translucent and pale under the weak light of the fog. They moved in perfect synchrony, weaving through reeds, their black eyes unblinking, gills opening and closing rhythmically. Some broke the surface, just enough to speak in whispers that vibrated in Claire's mind. You cannot save them. You will not belong. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the fog and through her thoughts. Claire shook violently, unable to block it. She realized the town had been lying, not just withholding the truth, but actively maintaining the cycle. Parents who once had children resisting were quietly compliant, terrified of defying the marsh. The pact had not just been for survival, it was enforcement, punishment, and acquiescence, passed down through generations. Resistance was not tolerated, and those who tried to intervene were tested, marked, and eventually warned or punished. A sudden splash jolted her. One of the resistant children broke free from the waterline, crawling awkwardly toward her with elongated limbs. Its gills opened wide, sloshing brine over the muddy bank, and its eyes gleamed with the unnatural awareness of what was to come. Claire froze, realizing the child's body was transforming in real time. Spine twisting, limbs stretching, skin paling into an unnatural translucence. She wanted to run, to scream, but the marsh had her attention fully, as if it demanded her acknowledgement of its dominion. From the corner of her eye, she saw the tendrils moving again, wrapping around the reeds, testing the edges of her awareness. She could feel them pushing at her, forcing her to stay, to witness. The children in the water surfaced briefly, forming a half circle around her. Their voices together vibrated within her skull. You do not belong. You cannot belong. You cannot belong. Claire felt something press against her leg, cold and wet, and looked down. Another piece of pale matter, soft and slimy, clung to her boots. Her stomach twisted violently, and nausea rose hot in her throat. She wanted to vomit, wanted to run, but her body refused to respond. The marsh had claimed her attention fully, holding her in a trance of horror and helplessness. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe minutes, before she stumbled back toward the town. The fog clung to her, swallowing the husks, the marsh, the children, until all that remained were the endless, whispering echoes inside her head. You do not belong. She knew then that no amount of intervention could save the resistant children without risking herself. The town's complicity was total, the marsh's dominion absolute. Even thinking about defiance carried a terrible cost. At her apartment, she collapsed onto the floor, shaking, brine still dripping from her clothes. The bowl on her table quivered faintly, as if alive. The whispers continued, soft and endless, echoing within her skull. Claire understood the terrible truth. The marsh was patient, eternal, and insatiable. The resistant children were already transforming, becoming something unrecognizable. Their bodies claimed fully by the water. Those who refused would vanish into husks, and the town would continue its quiet complicity, generations deep. Claire realized with a hollow, gnawing fear that she had been marked, not physically, but mentally, spiritually. The marsh had tested her, warned her, whispered into her mind, and she would never be free of its gaze. Even if she fled the town, even if she escaped the fog and the reeds, the knowledge of what lay beneath the water, and the children it claimed, would follow her, gnawing at her sanity, whispering from the corners of every shadow, echoing in the marrow of her bones. You do not belong. You cannot belong. Outside, the marsh rippled faintly, calm now, but waiting. Its patience infinite, its hunger eternal. Claire knew she had glimpsed only a fraction of its power. Resistance was futile. Observation alone was perilous. And the children, claimed or resisting, were neither safe nor human. They were something older, something alive, something patient, and utterly indifferent to human notions of mercy. The fog was thick and oppressive as Claire ran, mud clinging to her legs and reeds slapping against her face. The town behind her roared with the distant guttural chant of the ritual, the slow, synchronized movement of children and adults, bodies swaying toward the marsh in unison. The whispers she had endured for weeks now screamed in her mind, "You cannot belong! You cannot belong!" But instinct drove her forward, deeper into the reeds, away from the town's complicit eyes and the water's beckoning edge. Without thinking, she stumbled, then plunged into a darker, almost hidden channel of the marsh. The water rose swiftly around her waist, cold and brackish, dragging her further in. The reeds formed a cage of whispers and slick tangles, but she pressed on, driven by a compulsion she didn't yet understand. Beneath her, the mud swallowed her boots, pulling her down in a soft, resisting grip. And then the water shifted beneath her feet, giving way to a hollow, cavernous space unlike anything she had seen before. Below the surface, Her flashlight's beam revealed shapes slithering through the water. Bodies elongated and partially translucent, twisted in impossible ways, moving with a rhythm that was neither entirely human nor entirely animal. They were adults, men and women, older faces she recognized from the town, but their forms were half serpentine, limbs writhing, torsos bending like waterlogged branches. Faint scars marked their necks and shoulders, the remnants of gills that had been surgically removed, or surgically resealed over time. They pulsed in the water, glowing faintly with a phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from their merged bodies. Claire's stomach churned as she realized what she was seeing. These were the ancestors, the parents, the grandparents of the town, the ones who had succumbed willingly, or had been claimed fully by the marsh. They were no longer entirely human. Their flesh shimmered like liquid, their eyes hollow and reflective, gazing at her with an intelligence that transcended human thought. The cavern's walls were lined with roots and mud, illuminated faintly by glowing shapes that twisted and writhed, as if the water itself were alive, part of the entity they now served. The shapes moved rhythmically, almost in unison, and Claire felt the pulse beneath the water. Something massive. Something ancient, like a heart beating in mud and liquid light. It was impossible to gauge its size, but its presence filled the hollow with a low, vibrating pressure. She could feel it in her chest, a pressure that pressed down, heavy as lead, filling her with awe and dread. The whispers she had heard for weeks now became voices, overlapping in her mind, urging her forward. You belong, come closer. Her hands trembled as she reached out instinctively toward one of the slithering shapes. The adult, a woman with hair matted and floating, turned toward her. Its face was familiar, human enough to recognize, but its eyes were pools of black, and its limbs coiled unnaturally, half serpentine. It raised a hand, elongated and webbed, toward her. A shiver ran down Claire's spine. Every nerve screamed, warning her, yet some deeper part of her, memory or instinct, called her closer. She swam deeper into the heart of the hollow. Shapes undulated around her, rushing against her with faint friction that was not rough, not cold, but alive in a way she could feel through her skin. They did not speak aloud, yet the mental resonance in her skull grew stronger. The whispers evolving into comprehension. We are part of it. Part of the claim. And you have always been part of... Her head jerked back as the largest shape moved into view. It was massive, coiling and shifting, its eyes deep pools reflecting every dim light in the cavern. Beneath it, smaller forms swam, writhing with a fluid grace. Adults merged with water, their bodies oscillating in ways human anatomy could never accommodate. Claire felt her body respond, her fear coiling tight in her chest, yet a strange recognition fluttered at the edge of her mind. These were her people, her history, and she had been running from a truth she had never known. Something brushed against her arm, soft, slick, and insistent. She recoiled, but the sensation was electric, not painful, not harsh. It traced along her skin like a memory she couldn't place. Every pulse of the water, every undulation of the glowing forms seemed to communicate, pressing into her mind with the cadence of something eternal. You are here. You are ours. You are of the water. Claire's breathing quickened. Her thoughts collided, panic, awe, recognition. She could not turn back. The town's rituals, the husks, the children resisting, the ancient pact, it all culminated here. She realized she had been running from herself, as much as from the marsh. The entity pulsed beneath her, the water vibrating faintly, like a heart beating in tune with her own. And then she saw it, A mass deeper in the cavern, undulating with grotesque grace. A structure of bone and mud, coral and roots, glowing faintly, as if lit from inside. It was alive. A singular presence, a nexus of all the claimed and half-claimed, a beating entity of the marsh itself. Every movement sent ripples through the hollow. Every pulse, a note in a dark, drowned symphony. She understood the truth, and her mind twisted with both terror and revelation. The marsh, the entity, and the claimed adults were one, and she had been drawn to witness it all, to be recognized. She sank slowly toward the mass, the glowing shapes guiding her, brushing against her body with deliberate gentleness. Panic warred with fascination, horror warred with belonging. The whispered voices overlapping now, harmonized into something coherent. You have always been ours. You cannot resist. You belong. Claire's head broke the surface of a small cavity in the structure. Her body quivered, limbs slick with brine and mud, and for the first time, she felt the pulse of the entity directly through her own chest. It was infinite, eternal, and patient. She could sense every child claimed, every husk formed, every adult merged into this living, breathing amalgam. The water pressed against her skin as if inviting her in. And somewhere deep in her mind, she recognized the impossible truth. She had never been separate from this. Never an outsider. The cavern seemed to hum, a low resonant frequency that vibrated through her bones. Shapes slithered around her, gliding with a grace that twisted human understanding. Their gills pulsed, pale pink and rhythmic. Claire's skin prickled as she realized the inevitability. She'd been born here, her gills surgically removed, her memory altered, smuggled away to live as a human. And now the marsh was calling her home. The pulse grew stronger, as if the entity had been waiting all these years for her return. Her mind was flooded with images she could barely comprehend. Newborns being claimed, husks drying in the sun, children resisting, parents yielding. And through it all, the steady, inexorable truth whispered in every nerve. You belong. You belong. You are of the water. Claire sank deeper into the hollow, and for the first time she did not resist. The hollow beneath the marsh throbbed with light and sound as Claire sank deeper, the water around her vibrating with a heart own, and was not her own. The adults she had seen before undulated beside her, their elongated forms brushing against hers with gentle insistence. Their gills pulsed in time with the water, sending faint waves of resonance through her bones. Every nerve screamed with recognition, terror, and inevitability. She could feel the pulse of the marsh itself, the vast ancient presence that had claimed generations of her people, reaching for her, pulling at the core of her being. Ha! Ha! At the center of the hollow, a sunken altar appeared, built from bone and coral, slick with brine and encrusted with decades of salt and mud. Old surgical tools littered the platform, rusted yet still suggestive of use. And there, among the artifacts, lay a file stamped with her own name. Claire's hands shook as she opened it, the water thick and heavy around her. Every detail of her earliest life was there. Birth records, charts, notes carefully altered to hide the truth. Her gills had been surgically removed to hide her from the claiming, smuggled away so she could live as a human, ignorant of the pact that had bound her ancestors for generations. A low hum echoed through the hollow, vibrating through the water, through her chest, settling in her bones. Something vast stirred deeper in the cavern, a presence that was older than the town, older than the marsh itself. It pulsed, alive with a consciousness she could feel without thinking. The water around her thickened, forming currents that pulled at her hair, her clothes, her very limbs. The pulse synchronized with her heartbeat, or perhaps her heartbeat synchronized with it. And Claire realized, with a hollow clarity, she had never been separate. She had been claimed from birth, hidden temporarily, and now the marsh had finally called her home. Her neck began to ache, as though responding to a memory buried deeper than thought. 2 perfect lines split along her throat, skin separating in a precise, unnatural manner. Water coursed through the newly formed gills, sending shockwaves of awareness through her body. Pain and ecstasy collided. Fear and relief intertwined. Claire's eyes opened wide beneath the surface, pupils dilated, sensing not just the water, but the life pulsing through it. The glowing shapes, the adults, the resistant children who had finally yielded, and the husks scattered like warnings above the water. A current drew her closer to the sunken altar, where the skeletal remnants of past rituals shimmered faintly in the phosphorescent glow. She hovered above the file, realizing that every choice she had made, every step into the marsh, had been leading her here. The entity beneath the water rose subtly, forming a vague shape larger than the cavern itself, like a shadow of mud and light, pulsating in time with her newly awakened gills. It was patient, infinite, aware, and then the realization struck her fully. The ritual she had tried to escape, the chanting in the town, the husks, the resistant children, all of it had been preparation, shaping her return. She had not been an observer, she had been the culmination. Her body and mind surged with new awareness. She felt the presence in every fiber of her being, as if she were suddenly both herself and part of the entity that pulsed beneath the water. The water around her surged upward, and she rose from the hollow, breaking the surface with limbs slick and pale, gills open and pulsing, skin wet and glistening like moonlight. The town sprawled along the shore, its people kneeling in synchronized reverence, eyes wide with recognition, mouths silent in awe. Children watched from the edges of the fog, resisting or compliant, the transformation of their mentor complete before them. Claire's voice rose, not just from her lungs but from the entity itself, resonating across the marsh, vibrating in every skull and marrow. A new call, irresistible, deep as the ancient presence that had always claimed the town. She saw the children near the waterline, hesitant, trembling, resisting with what little human fear they could muster. Her gills pulsed in time with the current, a rhythmic thrum that penetrated even their awareness. Some shrieked, others froze, and a few began to step forward, drawn like moths to the impossible light of the hollow below. Claire felt herself guiding them, part human, part something far older, infinitely patient and terrifyingly alive. The resistant ones' bodies began to stretch, pale limbs elongating, gills opening, skin shimmering like liquid moonlight. The marsh claimed them without force. The rhythm of her voice and the entity's pulse made resistance impossible. The parents, the ancestors kneeling on the shore, watched as she moved among the children, observing the claiming in silent reverence. Some reached out, touching the water where their offspring swirled, their elongated limbs twitching with anticipatory awareness. They had become conduits, part of the pulsing entity, their voices silent yet resonant, guiding the new generation into the marsh. Claire's awareness expanded. She felt the husks floating above the mud in the sunlit shallows, the ones who had resisted and failed, and understood fully what awaited any who defied the rhythm. Obliteration into desiccated warnings, leaving only memory and echo. She drifted among the swirls of newly transformed children, noting their eyes, wide, black, alert, yet devoid of any purely human innocence. They were aware, intelligent, yet fully part of the marsh now, their gills pulsing in harmony with hers, their bodies a living testament to the entity's will. A faint hum rose from the deepest waters, merging with her own new voice, guiding the children deeper, back into the unseen labyrinth of the hollow, back to the source that had claimed their ancestors, back to the pulse that had always been their destiny. Claire's consciousness stretched across the water, She was aware of every chart, every husk, every whisper, every resisting heartbeat in the town. She understood the cycles, the patience, the inevitability, and she did not fear it. She had become both human and marsh-born, a bridge between the past and the future, a new locus of the claiming. She felt the fog swirl in recognition, the reeds bending as if bowing, the water itself waiting for her signal. And then, with one final vibrating resonance that echoed in every corner of the town, Claire's voice and the entities merged fully, calling the newborns, the children of the town, toward the water. The pulse spread outward, impossible to resist, and the youngest ones, gills flickering, began to answer. The water churned and glowed faintly, a luminous tide of pale skin and tiny, unblinking eyes. The claiming had reached its apex. The town watched in awe and dread as the transformation completed. Every step of resistance had been acknowledged. Every husk had been formed, and every compliant child had begun the slow, inevitable merging with the marsh. Claire's awareness, human and otherwise, pulsed through the water. She was the conduit, the warning, the harbinger, and the bridge between land and water. The fog thickened, rolling across the streets, swallowing everything except the glowing pulse of the marsh and its newest, fully integrated agent. As the tide of the claiming spread, the townspeople, kneeling on the shore, whispered prayers to nothing they could name. Some trembled, some cried, but none dared interfere. The children moved with purpose now, fully marsh-born, guided by Claire's voice and the entity's inexorable rhythm. The cycle continued, eternal, patient, unstoppable, a living testament of the pact that had bound this town for generations. And at the center of it all, rising from the water, gills opening and pulsing in synchrony with the heartbeat of the marsh, Claire was no longer just a nurse. She was the claiming incarnate. Her human past dissolved, her voice and consciousness merged with the vast pulsing heart of the water. And beneath the mist and fog, in the still brine-filled depths of the marsh, the new generation answered, their tiny bodies shimmering, pale and elongated, guided by a presence older than the town, older than memory, older than human comprehension. The children of the Salt Marsh had returned home.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.